Hi, everyone. Welcome back to Pedagogy Non Grata. It's a rare day because I'm doing two back-to-back episodes. And if you're a long-time listener to this podcast, you'll know I've gone from doing these shows twice a week to weekly to monthly and to now quite sporadically. And that's really because I'm just trying to have conversations with interesting and smart people in this field. And Anna Stokke is no exception to that. And I have to admit, I remember how to pronounce your name from when she introduced herself to me as Anna Stokke, like hockey. And it was the most Canadian introduction I've ever gotten. By the way, that makes me extra proud to have her on the podcast because we don't get a lot of Canadians on. So it's great. And I feel like because you're from Manitoba, you're more Canadian. That's
Oh
very
yeah,
controversial thing to say in the South where
definitely.
I currently live. But um, having lived in the northern parts of the country, I feel like they're a different place, they're a different culture, and they're more Canadian. Sorry, guys. Um, so it's very cool to have her on the podcast today. She is a professor in math education, and she's been on the podcast previously.
I'm
She's
not.
shaking.
I'm not. I'm a
Okay, correct
professor
me.
in math. I'm a math
You're a
professor.
professor in math. I
Yeah,
apologize.
that's
Um,
okay.
she was, she was previously on our podcast on our panel on the science of math, and we also met at Research Ed. We were both speakers at that Canadian conference, which was great to run into her and get to know her a little bit better. Um, Today, we're going to be talking a little bit about what do we see as wrong in math education today and where do we go forward. So, before I make any more blunders like saying you're a professor of math education,
That's
why
okay.
don't you tell the audience a little bit more about yourself, Anna?
Oh, sure. Well, so first of all, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be on your podcast and I appreciate you reaching out and looking forward to the conversation today. So yeah, as you mentioned, I'm a math professor, but it's not a surprise that you might have thought I was a math education professor because I actually do a lot of work in education. So I've been doing outreach and education for many years. I run a nonprofit after school program for kids in grades 4, 5, and 6. And I co-founded that with my husband, who's a mathematician, and some other mathematicians in the province about, I don't know, 11 years ago. So it's been a while, and we do all that work as volunteers. So I do that, and as you know, I have a podcast, Chalk and Talk, and I've been doing media interviews and things like that on math education for many years.
That's great. So, what got you interested in this topic, Anna?
Well, it had to do with my kids. So first of all, I've always cared a lot about teaching. I teach math at the university level. I love teaching math. I love teaching. I love math, and I try to do a really good job of it. So this all started when my daughter, my oldest daughter, was in, and I can't remember right now, but it was grade 2 or 3, and she went to school, and it seemed like they weren't really doing much math. And worse than that, they were doing really convoluted methods for simple arithmetic. So, lots of manipulatives and stuff like that. And that's all fine, but they're not computational tools. And there was no focus on, like, sorry, times tables, and there wasn't a lot of practice and stuff like that. And so we were concerned, and parents were reaching out to us, and they were concerned. So we started this after school math club. You'll probably end up doing this too, Nate. You'll see. You'll do anything for your kid, and you'll have kids coming over. So we had kids coming over once a week, and we would do math with them, and we would send them home with math to work on and that sort of thing. And so you can do that. Like, you can help your own kid, but we felt really bad, and there are all these other kids who don't have help, right? So we just started advocating for a better math curriculum in Manitoba and actually Western Canada, because we shared a math curriculum with the Western provinces. And so here's an example of the kind of thing that was going on. So teachers were not allowed to teach standard algorithms for arithmetic. So I'm talking addition with a
That's crazy
carry.
talk.
Right, I know. See, this didn't happen quite as badly in Ontario, right? So I'm talking addition with a carry, subtraction with a borrow, long division. That wasn't taught, right? And they weren't
It's
allowed, the
wild.
kids weren't even allowed to do it. So my daughter would go and she'd have her notebook under her desk, and she'd add up the numbers in columns, right? Because it's obviously easier, right?
Way
And
easier.
and she would have actually felt quite bad about herself if we hadn't helped her with the math at home. And to fast forward, she ended up getting a math degree. So anyway, we founded uh, an advocacy group at the time called Wise Math. And so we started meeting with government officials, with school divisions, and that sort of thing, and advocating for changes to the curriculum. And we did end up getting some changes to the curriculum in about I think it was around 2013, they made some changes.
You know what? There's so much I want to respond to in that and ask you. And I'm really glad we didn't have a set list of questions in advance because like I think we could have a more organic conversation.
Right.
Um, but the first thing I gotta unpack, and actually I do want to say that I'm really happy to hear you have this nonprofit and this is nonprofit roots. I think there's just so many people trying to make a buck in education. I hate to say it,
Right.
and I know I have things I sell, but
Yeah.
I think it makes education trainers less reputable because everyone, it's kind of like you feel like you're going to the used car salesman, not to throw used car salesmen under the bus um,
Yeah.
when you get education advice. So I think it's awesome that you're doing that. But um, how did we get to a place in education where teaching kids to add and subtract in columns was considered bad, and that kids had to hide it under the table like they were doing some deep dark
Sure.
secret? How did we get
Well,
there?
so that's a good question, and I've had lots of conversations with people about that, and I try to listen to what they say. So, in particular, at the time, I met with some math education professors in my university, and I listened to their thoughts on it. And I met with math consultants and listened to their thoughts on it. And they essentially were worried that children weren't getting the conceptual understanding of the algorithms. Okay. So they wanted to make sure that the children understood the algorithms. Well, we would say in that case, why don't you just make sure that the teachers teach the understanding? Like you can teach the understanding of the algorithms, right? And have the kids also do the algorithms and practice them. Well, there were some strange answers to that, okay? Like, for instance, well, the teachers won't do it. Or once the kids start using the algorithm, you can't go back, that's done because it's too
Citation,
easy,
please.
right? Yeah, lots of crazy ideas like that. Or we had to pull the rug out from under the teachers, because they just won't listen. We wanted them to do the understanding piece. Or the other one is that the teachers don't understand the algorithms, right? So it's better if they don't teach them and we give them resources where they have to use things like base 10 blocks and that sort of thing. So those were the kinds of things I was hearing.
Wow. Okay. Do you think there was any root in science or research behind these ideas?
No, no, definitely not. Okay, but that it's funny you mention that because that's what they always said, right? And so this was a real shock to me, I have to say, as someone that's I come from pure mathematics, right? Where everything's like you prove things and it's very serious, the research in mathematics, right? Now the research in education is a whole other story. All right. So when I went to my kids' school, the parent night, and they told us that research backs this up, that we shouldn't be teaching algorithms. I kind of took their word for it because, like, who would say research shows that when it actually doesn't? But then the research that we were given, you look at it and it's like, holy smokes, like, this is a case study that someone did with one kid, right? Or the main one they refer to as the Constance Cami piece. It's called, I should know this because I've picked this apart so many times. The harmful effects of standard algorithms. And we picked that apart on my podcast, actually. It's just absolute nonsense, right? Like these studies they're not set up well. There's not a decent control group. It's always biased towards what the researcher wants to come out in the end, right? So that's kind of where it went. But no, there is no research backing this up. It's people will tell you there is, but there isn't.
Yeah, I find that's a really big problem in education in general, in
Yeah.
terms of research, that people see the understanding seems to be that if there is a peer-reviewed study or paper, I should say, because sometimes they're not even really studies, but in science. And then, you hear people, well, I can find a peer-reviewed study to support anything. But it's oftentimes theoretical papers or case studies, which really aren't what I would call science. And it's not to say that those
Nope.
things are bad or not valid. It's just that they can't prove efficacy. They can't prove something works or
That's right.
doesn't work. They can only really create hypothesis, right? Um, but I think people don't understand that.
No.
That's my conception of the field in general. So
Yeah.
I have a follow-up question then. Is there research to support algorithms use? Is there research to
Yeah.
show if we teach algorithms, kids do better in math?
And that's a really good question, right? So, and I've looked for that research too, and I haven't really found any on that side of things either. Okay, so there is a study that was done by Stephen Norton where he kind of compared these two approaches. He's an Australian researcher. You can maybe look that up. But I haven't seen sort of any large scale study on it. Now, my argument to that is, look, if you're going to take something that mathematicians and people developed over, hundreds of years, because the whole idea is to come up with an efficient method, right? And throw it out the window. Well, the onus is on you to provide me with the research that says, getting rid of like years of wisdom is the way to go, right? I would also argue that just in terms of like, if you think of it as cognitive load, people always like to talk about cognitive load theory, right? It makes sense that the algorithms are going to take less cognitive load than using all these different convoluted strategies.
Mm. Yeah, I would generally agree that the cognitive load is way higher. Something I've always thought about is that I don't think I'm a person who could go out and create my own formula. And I've definitely heard educators say, well, the kids should be making their own formulas. Think how long it took for someone to think of Pythagorean theorem or, even to develop long division. I can't imagine telling a kid, you're going to figure that out on your own. I needed direct instruction to figure that out. I couldn't have done it without. So I don't
Well,
imagine that the average 5-year-old was doing that.
right. The kind of algorithms they come up with won't be good algorithms, right? So there'll be algorithms like tick marks or counting up or very like rudimentary algorithms. And I am a person that like I do math research for a living. Like that is my job, right? I have invented, new theorems and things like that and proved them. And that is a lot of background knowledge to get to that
Hmm.
point. It's highly unlikely that a child is going to come up with a standard something as good as the standard algorithm.
Mm. Well, you said something a few minutes ago that I thought was really interesting. You're talking about how, well, the kids aren't going to learn the concepts if we use algorithms. And that's why we have to use that inquiry-based method. I've always thought that was weird to me because it seems to be based on this assumption that you can't teach a concept, that you can only
Right.
discover a
Yeah,
concept.
yeah, yeah. I
And
know.
I'm going to ask, I was teaching fractions today, and I started off my fractions lessons by explaining the concept of what a fraction is. I don't know where this idea that you can't teach a concept comes from.
I think it's a misunderstanding of what conceptual understanding means. So, or the fact that it actually doesn't, it's not well defined. Like it doesn't have a real definition. Nobody even knows what it is. Like to me, understanding means knowing why like why something's true, right? Knowing what a definition means, like what's a prime number, right? And that sort of thing. And somehow, what I've observed though is a completely different idea of what understanding means. Like oftentimes, people seem to think it means visual, like everything has to be visual. But no, it doesn't. Like you can teach the standard algorithms why they're true simply like using place value, right? That you don't have to like draw pictures and things, right? Um, so I think there are some misunderstandings about it, but absolutely you can teach a concept, and that's what you should do, right? Like just teach the concept. Teach the concept and move on. And that's the teacher's job to teach the concept. It's not the kid's job, right? And they
Figure
don't
it
have to
out.
go over it over and over and over and over again. Like the whole point in mathematics is, yeah, we have something we want to do. We explain why it's true, and then we move on to an efficient method, right? We don't just go do everything using base 10 blocks over and over and over again, right? Like that's just a really inefficient, weird way to do something.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. I've, I've seen a lot of people suggest, well, sort of these inquiry-based, discovery-based lesson models where the kid will try and discover a concept. I'm thinking of the area of a square and versus the area of a triangle, where they take the kids and have them fold a piece of paper if it's a square into a triangle, and they're like, "And what do you notice?" And it's like a 20-minute discussion. I think
Okay.
it's way faster to draw a square on the board, draw a line through it, and be like, "A triangle is half a square." We know the
Yeah.
formula for area of square is length times width. Divide it by two, you have the formula for a triangle. It
Yes.
takes 2 minutes instead of 20 minutes.
Hmm.
And personally, I think it's just more valuable use of your instructional time. But there's
It
definitely some
is.
people out there who call me crazy for that.
Well, and just to back up on that, so the first one you mentioned with the paper and cutting the square in half and getting the kids to sort of think about it, I should say I don't have a huge problem with those kinds of things, right? I just think that that can't be the way you do it every time, right? Like it's okay to do that once in a while,
Yeah, I
because
agree.
right, because you can learn a lot from thinking about things that way, maybe. But it's really inefficient. And the other thing is, it doesn't have to be done that way. And it's probably not going to reach most of the students in the best way either. That's the other thing.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Well, let's talk about manipulatives in general, because I think that for whatever reason, we get kind of obsessed about manipulatives in education.
Yeah,
And you
I
were talking
know.
about that, sort of everything being about manipulatives. I'm going to be honest, last year was the first year I stopped using manipulatives on a regular basis in my classroom. And I had my best results as a teacher. And
Okay.
truthfully, I don't think that's a coincidence. Now, I teach grade eight, so that might be a huge part of why I found manipulatives not that helpful. But I do wonder
No
if
algebra tiles? You didn't use algebra
I
tiles?
did not use algebra
That
tiles.
is, they're the most ridiculous thing.
Oh,
I
really?
okay, yes,
Tell me about
right,
it. I
okay.
want to hear it. Why are
No, no.
algebra tiles ridiculous?
Well, it just, I don't know why you would do that, right? Like, it just doesn't make sense. It just makes things more complicated. The whole point of algebra is to move past pictures. That's why
Mm,
algebra was invented. Economy of thought, right? It makes things easier to do. It makes it easier to solve equations. So why would you go back? And I always found it really weird to see these pictures of older kids with manipulatives. Like,
mm,
it's not cute anymore, right? Like maybe it's
mm.
cute. You see all these kids, these young kids in grade 1 and 2 playing around with base 10 blocks, and oh, they're doing the concrete pictorial abstract stuff. That's great. But when a kid is like in grade 8, like do they really enjoy that?
I don't see it, and I agree with you. I think that's the funny. And this might be my bias as an intermediate teacher. I tend to teach very concretely in terms of not like manipulatives, but in like this is the algorithm, this is how it can be applied. And I find that kids actually kind of enjoy it because they find it very transparent. Like they can immediately get it and understand it. So I'm using the standard algorithms. Now I still apply it, I teach them the concepts, but I find that they tend to just be like, oh, I get this. This is easy. And I kind of want to be like, yeah, it is easy.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
Exactly.
okay.
So I
So,
don't I don't hate manipulatives. I should just back up because
I,
you said we're gonna have a conversation about manipulatives and we just said all sorts of bad things. So I mean, so for instance, in our after school program, and those are young kids, like grade 4, 5, 6, we do start off everything with manipulatives, right? And but then we do move on to the algorithms. And the point is they need to get the most practice with the algorithms. That's where they
I
need the
agree.
practice.
I agree with that. So, I think of it in terms of repetition. Everybody can learn math, but some
Yep.
kids are going to need to see that formula and do that formula 2 or 3 times, and they're going to have it. Some kids might even be once. I've definitely met kids that fall in that category. And there might be kids who are like me, so I wasn't a good math student, who might need 10, 20, 30 times. And I feel like it's hard to get that repetition in if
Yeah.
everything is spent on manipulatives and games. But I agree with you
Yeah.
too in that when I taught grade two, we used a ton of manipulatives. And it was just because they didn't even understand necessarily what numbers were always.
Right.
They needed that really
Exactly.
basic understanding.
Yeah.
So, how do you think math is being promoted right now? What do you think is the sort of the standard approach to telling teachers how they should teach math today?
Well, good question. So, well, you tell me, you're the teacher. I mean, I'll tell you what I sort of hear, right?
Mm,
Um, there's a lot of people really like building thinking classrooms, so I see that one around a lot. Um, I think what you said, I think there is a heavy emphasis on manipulatives. I think there's a heavy emphasis on conceptual understanding, which isn't a bad thing. It's just the emphasis is too much on that side, and then the kids aren't
yeah,
getting enough practice. And when you don't get enough practice, you don't get good at things, right? And because math is I always say relentlessly hierarchical, right? It's very, very cumulative. So if
I
you're
agree.
missing any steps on the ladder, it's going to be really hard. And so if you're not getting enough practice at each rung of the ladder, it's just gonna snowball, right? And like you said, those kids who don't need as much practice, they're just gonna fly ahead, and the others are gonna fall behind.
Yeah, when I look at a lot of the most popular voices in this field, I hear that same thing, that same narrative of conceptual understanding is what matters. We teach that through require-based learning, can't be taught directly. In fact, I hear that, oh, if you teach just through direct instruction, you're only teaching procedures, which again, I'm always like, what? Why? Um, and then I think on the extreme end, I hear people saying never teach algorithms. And it's
Yeah,
funny, I put a post about how I thought um, on Twitter how that was one of the most damaging narratives out there. And somebody
right.
responded with, no education person is actually promoting that. And somebody responded to say, I'm promoting that.
Oh
I
yeah,
believe algorithms are harmful for children. And I was
yeah,
just like, well, read the comment below. This person does.
yes.
But
There are
um,
definitely people that promote that. Yeah.
yeah. Um, so what about in terms of what do you think we need more of in our classrooms? What do you think what would you like to see more of in teacher education and also being promoted by people in this space?
Okay, so well, first of all, their foundational skills are important, and I think they're not emphasized enough. So I think things like, and I go on about this all the time, memorizing times tables. Like that's a simple thing. I think it's probably one of the most important things that an elementary school teacher can make sure their students do. Because
Mhm.
think about it. What is that person going to use throughout their entire life, like almost every day, right? Like I'm not kidding you. I was at the mall last week. I'm in the change room and I hear two girls having a conversation. They're probably around 19 or whatever. And the one says, "Yeah, I was so embarrassed. I had to pull out the calculator to do 16 divided by 4 in front of my boyfriend's parents because I didn't want to embarrass myself because I didn't know what it was." It's like, "Really? Like is this what we want? Like come on." You know? It's one of the most important things you can do is make sure that kids memorize times tables and then just focus on the things that are going to help them do well in algebra, right? Because if they can do well in algebra, the world is open to them, right? They can go to university, they can take calculus, and they can have all sorts of careers. So fractions, it's really important to be really good at adding, subtracting, multiplying, and dividing fractions. And I'm not talking about drawing pizzas. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about like I don't want to see people drawing pizzas in my calculus class. That is going to be a disaster for them and it's going to be embarrassing, right? They need lots of practice with fractions and things like that. So I just feel like the pendulum has to swing back from where it is. Like there's too much focus on conceptual understanding, whatever that means, and inquiry-based learning you mentioned, right? And not enough focus on just making sure that students have skills.
Yeah, I think that's great. I'm gonna ask you a really specific question about fractions instruction because we're talking about standard algorithms a little. Um, I have found that in general, students struggle with fractions
Yeah, they do.
um, a lot. And I had John Starr on this podcast years ago, and he talked about multiple algorithms. And one of the alternative algorithms I offer them is teaching them that fractions are secretly a division question, and that you
Are
can just
secretly a
secretly a
division?
division
Yeah.
question,
Okay.
and that
Yeah.
you can just divide the top number by the bottom number and then turn it into a decimal question. Because personally, I find a decimal question easier to work with um, versus a fraction question. I do teach them both methods, but I'm curious if what your thoughts are on teaching them that as an algorithm.
Mm,
You have
okay.
you have thoughts
So
that are negative. Okay, let me hear it.
yeah, well, no, okay. So I think that it's good to be flexible, to be able
Yeah,
to move from a rational number, right, to a decimal. Okay.
yeah,
But I mean, what are you going to do? Like, what are you going to do when it's something like one third, right? And you've got a
yeah.
repeating decimal. How's this going to help? If you've got to add and divide and this sort of thing. So, I would say, we normally in like when we're at the university level, we keep things in fractional form, to be
Oh,
honest.
really?
Yeah, improper. fraction
That's
too, not mixed. Yeah.
that's interesting. That's good to
Yeah.
know. I guess as an adult, I've had to use decimals a lot more than I've had
Yeah.
fractions. The only
Yeah.
place as an adult I have to use fractions on a regular basis is cooking. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
and then
Right.
I'm going to be honest, I don't tend to be that accurate. I tend to just ballpark it
Yeah,
when
for
cooking.
sure. Yeah.
But
But Nate, that's not, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with what you're doing at all. In fact, I think, um, in terms of like seeing, where does this number sit on the real number line?
mhm.
Sometimes I think students are better with the decimal representation, right? So you can go back and forth, you know?
Yeah, like I
But
said, I do teach them both. But I have
yeah,
found that students find that decimal algorithm a lot easier. But you're right. I was looking at 0.33 plus 0.66 today in class to infinity because I had done 2/3 versus 1/3
yeah,
or
yeah.
add to 1/3.
Yes.
And it was a messy number. And I was like, this is the downside of this for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, I would say definitely you need to make sure that they can add fractions, add
mhm.
like and work with fractions no matter what, right? So they can go back and forth in between the decimals if they want, but they need to be able to work with the actual fractions.
That's fair. Okay. Well, are there any things that you think are not talked about enough in math? I kind of go back to that John Starr example for a second. I really like being able to teach two algorithms instead of one. Not necessarily all the time, but when a student is struggling with something, I like to be able to pull a second algorithm out of my pocket and show them in case it's something that's easier for them. Is there anything that you find that is particularly helpful for students that is a tool or a strategy teachers can use?
A tool or a strategy? Well, I would say that, so for me, I think with anything, I think the main thing is to break things down and
Mm,
into small parts. So to really scaffold things. I would say that, that's probably one of the mistakes that most people make is not breaking things down enough or underestimating how much they need to break things down into component parts. Um, I don't know. I'd say that. I'm not sure. Are you asking me about what topics in math should be emphasized more?
Well, we can do that too, but I just thought if there's anything in specific that you thought is underemphasized in math that you could do more. But I actually really agree with you on the chunking part.
Yeah.
And I find that, teachers who are really good at math, sometimes that's where they struggle because
Yeah,
it
yeah.
comes naturally to them
100%.
and they don't necessarily think, oh, I have to break it down that far. And I think one of the reasons I'm good at teaching math, if I'm being honest, is because I was a bad math student.
Okay.
So I
Yeah.
know how far I
Yeah.
have to chunk it down to get their understanding.
It's
But
that's the curse of knowledge, right? And that can be the hardest thing. And I know about the curse of knowledge. And I still make this mistake that I underestimate how much my students need things broken down because I already know how to do it and it seems easy. And it's easy to underestimate how long it takes them to get good at
oh yeah,
something
for
too.
sure. For sure. And I would imagine that almost be harder at teaching at the university level because you assume that all of the instruction all the way along was good and that they have the high school level knowledge math, and you might end up with some students who are missing some high school instructional pieces, right?
That's
Or
right.
worse,
Well,
elementary.
it is and it isn't. So on the one hand, our courses have prerequisites, right?
Mm.
Whereas you don't have that. So you often have like large ranges in your class. And but honestly, we we at this stage, we assume that the students don't know the pre-calculus very well. And we make them relearn it. We have a workshop they have to do it. They have to take a test on it. Otherwise, they'll struggle in the class.
Oh, really?
Oh
That's
yeah.
good stuff.
I have a podcast
Calculus is,
episode coming up about this, by the way, with
yeah.
three, yeah, university profs. Yeah.
I had a student a while back who was really enriched and really advanced, and I started to try and learn calculus so I could share it with them, like self-teaching. And I was like, oh my God, calculus is so hard. So I I can't imagine. Um,
It's not hard if you know algebra. So if you know
yeah, I think
algebra,
I'm good at algebra, but I find calculus terribly hard.
okay. Okay.
But
Well, I could teach you. You,
oh, you could. Maybe this is my problem. This is the problem is I tried to learn it through an inquiry-based
yeah.
method. I was sitting there
Yeah.
on Chat GPT typing, Chat GPT, can you explain calculus to me? And it just gave me like nothing but conceptual knowledge. And I was like, Where are my
Oh yeah.
formulas?
Yeah,
Why is
yeah.
there no procedural instruction?
Oh
But
yeah. Yeah.
I think I'm personally a very procedural learner. But if that's a thing, and let me ask you, do you think that's a thing? Do you think some people can be more of a conceptual learner versus a procedural learner? Or do you think
I
that's a bit of a
do.
myth?
I
You
do.
do? Oh, really?
Yeah. I mean, well, okay. So, I mean, it's interesting that you asked this because so I teach intro calc all the time. And I also teach an upper level, like a third year level class. And that class is all theoretical. Okay. So
Mm,
they're very different. Like calculus is very procedural, or I mean, you could do it conceptual, but it's people care about the procedures because, like, that's what the applied people want, right? So, but the other one isn't. And actually, I'll say where you sort of see people really start to struggle is when we have the intro to proof course. You know, there's some
mm.
people that just are awesome with the procedures, and then when you start doing I would call that the conceptual piece, the more theoretical piece, they really don't like it. They really struggle. You can see the other way around sometimes too, but not that frequently. So yeah, I do think that.
No, that makes total sense to me because I can memorize the formula and memorize when and where to apply it, but still not have a solid understanding of why and how that formula works the way it does. But truthfully, that doesn't bother me.
And it
I'm
shouldn't.
perfectly fine knowing
Okay.
I know when to use this formula, how
Yes,
to use it, and how to do it
exactly.
correctly, but not understand the underlying formula whatsoever.
So this, let can we talk about that for a minute, what you just said?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So this is an important point. And I think that there's this idea out there that everybody has to understand everything, but they don't. Okay? And let's quit making people feel bad when they can't explain why the formula works, right? Because some people are just going to use the formulas. You think the engineers care? They don't care, right? I mean, I've taught engineers. They'll say, stop it, because like I'll give the proofs because I'm a mathematician, right? So I want to say why things are true. It's like, stop it, quit doing that. We just want the formula, you know. So I think we really need to get away from this like obsession with everybody having to understand everything. It's not realistic and it's not necessary, and I think it's making a lot of people feel bad when they can actually be good at math without having to do the whole conceptual piece or what
Mm.
somebody has decided conceptual understanding means.
Yeah, totally. Can I give a concrete example of this?
Yes?
I have done the Hedges G calculation hundreds of times, if not thousands of times. And I understand that it's the mean difference divided by the standard deviation, and it's the pooled standard deviation to correct for sample size. So I
Okay.
understand how to interpret that in the context. But do I have memorized exactly how to pool a standard deviation? No, I have it written down on a piece of paper,
Yeah,
and I follow that piece of paper.
that's right.
And I'm not sitting there thinking about, well, why am I pooling this, and what does the pooling really mean? I don't even really know. I just know that it's used in
Yeah.
that situation for that context, and this is how we interpret it. But how
So
many
you like
people?
statistics. You like statistics.
I do. I love stats,
Okay.
but
Yeah.
I definitely am not learning it every. I'm not learning the or origins of each individual formula.
No.
You know, I'm
And
learning when
actually,
they're used and how to use them.
you know what? Let's bring up statistics now that you
Okay, great.
mention this. Because there are all these there's so many contradictions out there, right? Okay, so there's e.g., you know, we'll just say a math education professor that developed what's called a data science program that actually isn't really a data science program, but you probably know what I'm talking about, yeah?
I'm not familiar with the course, but that's okay.
Really? Okay, okay, okay. Well, anyway, there's this math education professor in, let's say, uh, California. Okay.
Okay, now I know who you're talking about.
Anyway, she developed this data science class, right? And okay, but it's not really data science, so it's like more like data literacy. Now, on the one hand, they're promoting data science, right? And on the other hand, they're promoting conceptual understanding. Children must understand everything. Well, when people use statistics, like which is, part of data science, really, we teach intro stats. I don't teach intro stats, but I'm in a math stats department. And when we teach intro stats, nobody explains why anything's true. Like it's all techniques. Why?
Hmm.
Because it's used in so many fields. Like it's used in psychology. It would be used in a good education research study. It's used in sociology, criminology. They're using statistics. They don't want to know the why behind everything, and they're able to use the statistics for their studies, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of contradictions out there
Yeah,
about,
definitely.
yeah,
Think of p-values. I saw an article about this, and it was basically titled "Nobody Understands p-values." Because how many people can explain the why of a p-value? People know when to use it and what
yes,
it means,
yeah, yeah,
and they can type into their calculator the p-value calculation, but
yeah,
they don't understand the why they're calculating it the way they're calculating it. At least I
no.
don't think the average person does.
And actually, a lot of the stuff behind the statistics is really, really tough,
Complicated.
right?
Yeah,
Like
super complicated.
it would be hard to explain all that. So that's also another reason, but it's clearly not necessary all the time to
Hmm.
understand everything.
But there was a literature review by Bethany Riddle. I'm sure you're familiar with from in 2018, talking about
Right.
how conceptual and procedural knowledge are linked. Would you agree with that? Because I think that makes sense to me. That sometimes they have a synergistic effect, and maybe that's
Okay.
different in
I'll
different contexts. But
Sure. I'll tell you what I think about that. I think that okay, so I have a friend, Steve Wilson. He's a mathematician, and he always says it's a lot easier to understand something you know how to do than something you don't know how to do. And
I
I
agree.
kind of agree with that. I think a lot of times the understanding comes after you know how to do something. Just because you have the confidence, you've done it many times, right? You know how it works, and then the understanding piece comes later.
I agree.
So I think that there tends to be sort of this idea that you have to do the understanding first, and only after the child understands can you go to the procedure, and that's not right. And then then there's the other idea that they have to be intertwined. So you'll sort of hear that a lot too. Go from understanding to procedure to understanding to procedure. I mean, like when I teach things, I usually explain why they're true. I should. I'm that's my job, right? But
Right.
I don't expect people to regurgitate it all the time, and I know they won't remember either. But I also know there's a lot of math I've learned that I didn't understand it until many years later. So, yeah, so those are my thoughts on that.
I totally agree. I mean, when I said today I was teaching fractions, and I explained the concepts behind fractions. But when I give out my fractions test, there will be no questions about the concepts behind fractions. The test will be here's some adding and subtracting, multiplying and dividing fractions questions, and you do that. I won't be asking them, you know, how is a fractions unit interacting with the base 10 unit?
Yeah,
That just won't be
sure.
a thing.
Yeah.
Um, but I think, sometimes procedural knowledge just deepens conceptual. Like, look at multiplications. You're talking about times tables. I feel like really having times tables at like an automatized level where it's just instantaneous, it sort of builds your understanding of how math relates to itself. And I think it really helps later conceptual understanding.
Yeah, definitely. Let me ask you something about times tables. Can I ask you a question?
Absolutely.
Okay, because you're a
But
teacher.
please don't start quizzing me because I'm not the best.
I won't. I would never do that. Believe me, I know, I know, I know, I know.
I was just joking.
Okay, I would never do that. So listen, it's weird because like I've had conversations with teachers and in fact just on the weekend, and they were telling me that, oh, there's just some kids that can't memorize their times tables. It's, kids with learning disabilities and that sort of thing, that they're not able to memorize their times tables. And this actually doesn't make sense to me because I think if you can't memorize times tables, then you can't memorize anything. Like, what's the difference between memorizing 6 times 7 is 42 and memorizing the lyrics to a Taylor Swift song? So, are you telling
It's
me
so,
that these kids can't memorize anything? Like, this doesn't make sense. So, I'm curious like, you're a teacher. What do you think?
oh, I have so many thoughts on this, but it's so funny that to me that you chose 6 times 7 is 42 because I really struggle with math and I was terrible at memorizing them. And my father drilled times tables into my head like it was nobody's business because he wanted me to know that. And the number he did the most times was 6 times 7 because I really struggle with that one. And now
Yeah.
that's the one I have like the most automatized. Like the second anyone says 6 times 7, I'm like, it's
Right.
42.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
It's I think what it really comes down to is that every kid's different and they're going to learn at different rates. And some kids, they might need it two, three times. Some kids might be like me, they might need it 20, 30, and there might be a kid who needs it 100. But I actually think we do that kid a terrible disservice if we say, oh, this kid can't learn it, so we're not going to teach it to them. I think it tends to be the opposite. That kid needs more repetitions. That kid needs more support. They don't need less. I think it's no
Right.
different than saying a dyslexic student can't learn how to read and we should just stop teaching them. I think that's like a horrible, horrible thing to say. I
It's
think just some kids are going to
ableist
need more
in
support.
my mind. Like
Pardon me?
it's ableist in my opinion. I don't I just can't understand it. Like I think what you're saying is correct. I think it's just needing more repetitions and maybe breaking things down more. I don't know.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, this has been a really fun conversation. I just enjoyed having a chat with you, to be honest. And I hope the listeners have had fun listening to our conversation. It's going to be pretty raw because none of the questions were pre-established, and
That's
I'm not going to
right.
do any editing. So the listeners are just having our conversation, and hopefully they get something out of it. Where can people find more about you, Anna?
Well, I have a website. It's anastocky.com. So pretty much everything about me is there. So or you can just Google me and find stuff out. So yeah, that's pretty much it. And check out my podcast. It's called Chalk and Talk. It's on all the podcast apps, and I have lots of conversations about teaching math.
And that's great. And you know what? I've heard a ton of positive things about your podcast from a lot of people who are really smart in this field. So I think that's great. All right,
Well,
everyone.
thank you. And thank you so much for having me. And yeah, it was unscripted. So hopefully, that was me kind of unplugged. So hopefully I didn't say anything too offensive.
Well, you know what? I'm glad. Shout out to Amanda Vanderheen. So you guys run a podcast together, and I've had her on a couple times. And every time she comes on, she gives me questions with by surprise, but they're math questions, and she's just like,
Oh,
"Oh, and Nate,
really?
what's 11 times 14?" I was like, "Ah, I
Yeah,
don't
yeah.
know. I don't have my 14 timetables memorized." But I can't remember that exact question she asked me, but she's done that to me a few times. So I'm glad you didn't quiz me. Although Amanda
No.
Vanderheeden is fantastic and really brilliant too, so
Yeah,
everyone
she
check
is.
her out
She's
also.
great. Yeah.
All right, that's it for now, folks. Until next time.